This show is brought to you by Safety FM.
Welcome to episode 20 of the Practice of Learning Teams. Today's podcast is the first of a series of 4 episodes as we take the podcast on a virtual tour of Australia and looking at how the Australians are applying learning teams to improve organisational learning. On today's show, we're joined by my colleague and co-author Brent Robinson and our special guest Deirdre Lewis from Origin Energy. Some of our listeners may have heard Deirdre on Dr. Todd Conklin's Practice and Investigation podcast, episode number 315, when they talked about learning from uncertainty. On today's podcast, Deirdre will share with us her learning team's journey, and we'll explore a range of views on using learning teams for crisis events such as the Australian bushfires, the difference between sharing versus learning with learning teams, how to prepare leadership for learning teams, learning teams and psychological safety, justifying the cost of a learning team, using learning teams for successful work, the importance of coaching and mentoring facilitators of learning teams, and the value of soak time. And we'll wrap up by talking about using learning teams outside of safety. Don't forget, in our final episode for the month, I'll then be joined by my fellow colleagues Glynis McCarthy and Brent Robinson, and we'll conduct a mini learning team on the key threads and themes that emerge during a virtual tour of Australia. So welcome to the Practice of Learning Teams podcast series. It's great that you could join us so early in the morning in Australia. Good morning to you, Deirdre.
Thanks for inviting me. It's really nice to be here.
Fantastic. And this is going live as part of our Learning Teams Down Under month for Australia. And later on the year, we'll be doing also a series on learning teams for New Zealand, so that forgotten country. But we thought we'd like to start with the larger continent first. So do you want to talk a little bit briefly about your guys' learning teams journey so far, how it started?
Yeah, sure. So we've sort of been on we've had a lot of discussion in the business over the last probably 2 or 3 years around how we can learn better as an organisation, and really trying to get our heads around what that can look like and what tools we can use. And we're probably floundering around a little bit to kind of think about how we can learn more deeply from what we were doing. So we were thinking we were learning, but not really learning. We were probably sharing more than we were learning, I would say. So I guess went and really did a little bit of research, read some stuff. Was looking at the work that Todd Conklin had been doing around asking better questions, and really thought, well, I'm going to have a crack at this. There was a couple of big things that were going on at the time when we first started to really have a go, and started having a look. The very first one we did actually was during last year's bushfire season in Australia, and our team just did a tremendous job managing and being resilient in the face of such a huge crisis. So rather than leaving that opportunity on the table, we didn't have anything bad happen in terms of our people or our facilities were safe. I really wanted to learn from what we were doing well, and really understand why that actually happened in our organisation, and how we were adapting and being resilient in the face of such a crisis across a huge amount of the Australian context. So we had a number of our big facilities and some of our smaller facilities at risk from the fires. That's kind of where we started. And I engaged our operational teams at the sites, and essentially we just pulled together a learning team. We were trying to do it face-to-face, but with everything going on, we ended up doing it virtually. So our very first experience as a learning team was a virtual experience. And so that's really how we started it, and really just took guidance from some of the materials that were out there in books and through podcasts and just things that we've been listening to. So that's really the start of the journey, I guess, for us.
So you're really just giving it a go?
Yes.
I like that bit you said around you sharing versus learning. I think that's really interesting, because what made you think that you were just sharing versus learning? What was that difference in your mind?
Yeah, so it was more that things were being pushed out into the business through, the usual safety artifacts, so things like alerts or notices or things like that. They just go out into the business, and we would share things with people that they might have a chat at a toolbox talk about them, but it wasn't any deeper than that. It was more, this happened in this place, and these are the one or two things that maybe you can do over here. But it was no more than that, really. It felt very much on the surface, and certainly from an operational perspective, as well as from a perspective, there was a fair bit of frustration about that, feeling like all this work and effort was going into something that pretty much just sent out and went into the ether a little bit. So we knew that there was some opportunity that we were essentially leaving on the table, and that's really where that deeper conversation started to occur around how do we actually really learn a bit better.
Yeah.
So from what I'm hearing, basically the difference between the sharing and the learning, one was about the context, getting that deeper, richer conversation going.
Yeah.
And the second one is, to me, it sounds like active feedback.
Yeah, definitely feedback from the people who are involved in these things, as well as from the safety team, as well as the HSC team. Yeah.
Right. So that it became more of a two-way conversation.
Yeah, I think as an organisation, we've actually had a journey where that two-way conversation happens pretty well between the functional team and the frontline. But I think what we didn't have was really any mechanism we didn't feel like we had a mechanism to actually help to propel us from sharing into learning. And that's really where I think the learning team's process is starting to come into its own from our perspective as an organisation, because it gives us a way to actually delve deeper into what's actually going on versus having a more surface level discussion.
Right. And this thing about giving it a go, how did that sit with leadership? How did we prepare leadership for what giving it a go looks like?
Well, so it depends on what you mean by leadership. And I think there's levels of leadership. Mostly I just didn't gazette it too broadly. I just said, this is what we're going to do. Are you on board? Let's have a crack at something different. That was kind of where it started. So it wasn't like I went, okay, we're going to do this whole new thing. It was more, okay, let's have a crack at trying to learn more deeply into this. We kind of feel like we did a good job. Let's understand, how we got there. And so I think doing it around the first one in particular, doing it around something that the business felt that they'd done very successfully was a really good place to start, because there was no opposition there was no fear, I think, as well. So people were they wanted to embrace the fact that they'd done something really well and to celebrate it and to learn why that was the case. So I think it was a really good thing to start with, if you like.
Yes, okay. Trying to minimise the exposure point.
So I'm just thinking about your point about you didn't gazette it, and it wasn't this top-down program that you were rolling out. You were really just celebrating some of the successes that you'd had within the business.
Yeah, definitely. I think everyone wanted to. So I think everyone was talking at a very senior level, all the way down through the organisation, around what a success that the operational teams had in terms of mitigating the risk to our people and the assets that we have in Australia when those fires were coming through. And so I think the conversation that I had at the senior level was, well, let's understand why that's the case. And so that was kind of my what do you call it, like my license to just do what I wanted. And then I just decided I was going to do a learning team, and that was how that's how I was going to get the richness of information. So I didn't it wasn't something that we went, oh, let's have this program, or it was just like, let's find out why we were successful, and let's talk to the people who were responding during the crisis at the front end of the work.
And it's going to be the most, the severity of those fires, the size of the fire front, and the adaptability of your organisation to perform that successful work. That's an amazing outcome, because it just went on for months and months, really, didn't it?
Oh, it was unbelievable, actually. And I think one of the things that our organisation's particularly good at is responding in crisis. So we're very resilient and adaptable as an organisation. And in a way, because that's our culture, one of the things that it's almost one of the things we take for granted. And what I really wanted to understand was, well, what makes us like that? So then when we're faced with other things, that we can be more conscious about why we're successful in those kinds of activities, so that we can take that and actually then transport to other things that we might not be as good at. So because that flexibility and adaptability and resilience is just it's just gold for an organisation, right? So, and I think we've also demonstrated that through the COVID crisis as well. The way that the organisation managed to respond very early and quickly, it was phenomenal, to be honest. So I've never seen our organisation respond as quickly and as well as that. And I think the same kind of culture was in evidence when we responded to the bushfires. So,
So it's a bit like you're sort of normalising that whole adaptive component.
Yeah.
Between this one event and this other event, everyone was like pre-charged with what that looks like in terms of the adaptability, that it's okay. That resilience is something we should encourage and encompass.
But also, I think, understand. So I think that's the thing too. We need to understand that we have it and what it actually looks like, so that we can be deliberate about building that, and it's not just something that sits as a capability in the organisation and we undervalue it. So I think there's something to be said for pulling out when things go well in a crisis, or well normally, because we deal with crises all the time, right? So
your business,
yeah, that's right. So, but I think it's then about being really conscious of the things that we're doing, so that we can bring it into day-to-day learning versus waiting for a crisis to happen. So it might be just that we're doing a small piece of operational work, and we recognise that we've actually got a deeper pool of resilience sitting in the business and capacity sitting in the business that we didn't really understand that we had. So I think the learning teams process helps us to unpick some of that, and often you see that a lot of the I guess in the early days, and we've done this a fair bit as well, as we learn from things that go wrong, but are also really keen to think about how do we learn from when we're doing things well and when things are going right. So that's where we actually started, which is a little bit.
Look, it's a challenge, and we talk about learning teams is about trying to make that operational learning a bit more visible and transparent. In the book, The Practice of Learning Teams, we sort of talk about the difference between organisational learning and worker learning. How have you been able to look at those two things as being quite different? What's been your feeling about that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, obviously there are differences. I think, I think part of the journey to being a business or an organisation that's really thinking about learning is, I guess the journey we've been on is really thinking about how we do that at all levels in the organisation and what does that actually look and feel like. So we're still probably working through a journey around that. And from a leadership perspective, I know we talked briefly about it before in terms of that first learning team that we did, but I think our leadership is on quite a good learning curve, if you like. It's probably the wrong terminology to use, but I think we're starting to really think about how we have deeper learning. So not just operational, but how do we think about learning more broadly? So, even from the board down, we're kind of in all different stages of learning as a business. So yeah.
Do you, with that learning, is there a feeling within the organisation that you need to capture it? Or, and back to that sharing thing, do you share it? I mean, how does that work for you guys? How do you move that round?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I think it's a bit like, what we were talking about before. The sharing was sort of we're just pushing stuff out into the business, but I didn't really want to do that. So there's been different things that I've been trying in terms of it's not so much sharing, it's about telling the story, or that's how I kind of like to
that's a great
talk about it.
That's a great way to describe it, actually. That's really cool.
Yeah. So part of what that looks like for me is like I've been doing little videos with the people who've been involved in the learning teams and asking them about not just what they learned or how they learned together, because what we've been finding is that they're actually the facilitators in there and helping to guide the conversation, but when it goes super well, they're actually asking each other questions. And so there's a piece around what the team learned, and then there's also this piece that I've been exploring with the people who've been involved is around, well, what else did you learn about our business or about the process or about how we're interfacing as an organisation. So, I didn't realise that because it was a silo here, or I didn't realise that because I didn't understand the process, or whatever it was. So we're capturing that on little video snippets and then sharing them in ways that a business can access. But it's the stories from the people involved. And those are things that I've been sharing from at the board level all the way down back in through to the teams, the teams who created the videos are the first ones to see it. So they're actually using it to go, oh, look, be really cool if you're involved in one of these, because I learned so much. It was such a great experience. Have a look at my video, and we've kind of just snippets. They're not long videos. They're just little talk points, right? So yeah.
That's very cool. So they're being distributed throughout the business.
Yeah, and in different channels. So I might put, for example, at the board, I might embed the link to a video in a very structured board paper. I might put it on a workplace channel so people can watch the video, or I might they might use it as a link in a toolbox talk. So different channels for different teams, but essentially the same material.
Okay. Wow. That's a great way of getting it out there. It's, so much better than, quite often you see people pumping out emails about sharing something or doing something, but it becomes this very one-way document. And that's a really interesting way of doing it with a video.
I think it is. And the other thing that has been really helpful is I've been doing like what I'm calling like little learning webinars in the business, and anybody across the whole business can join in, whether you're a truck driver or whether you're the CEO. And we're just getting people to come in and talk about stuff. It doesn't have to be a learning team thing. It could be anything. And those sorts of things have been getting a fair bit of traction as well. And so I think the more channels that you've got to have a discussion the better. And you just got to really recognise that a truck driver is not going to read a 5-page document or never going to read a report, right? Because one, they don't have time, and two, it probably isn't that interesting, right? But they will watch a peer having a 5-minute conversation on a video at their lunch break. So I think those sorts of things, we just got to be really mindful of that, because otherwise you end up just gazetting to one channel.
Yeah, and look, we've recently been asked by a couple of organisations to do like a little mini podcast for them. The same thing, to try and capture some of that organisational learning and try and capture some of that worker learning, and then sort of put it into a little pod type thing that they can distribute out. Because a lot of people these days can get access to the pod.
Yeah, I think they're really good things. I think I think the more that you can communicate, the better. I mean, podcasts are a great way to communicate. It's one channel. Some people love them, other people hate them, right? So I think a
YouTuber or a podder.
Well, and some people, I'd done another podcast, and somebody sent me notes, and they'd listened to it when they were, riding their bicycle to work, and how cool it was. I was like, well, that's really great for that individual, but other people going, oh my God, I can't stand the sound of her voice, and I don't want to hear her. I'd rather listen to, the guy who was driving the tractor, and so I think it's just about having as many modes of communication as you possibly can have. And then what I think occurs, and this is certainly what's been happening in my business, is that there's a little bit of momentum that starts to happen, and people just want to get involved. So as soon as you start getting that real pull of like, oh, I want to be involved in the learning team, how come I wasn't involved in that one, and I want to do the next one, or can I facilitate one, and there gets this excitement around participation and being involved and being part of the solution, because often the excitement comes from the fact that the people who are involved in the process are the ones who are actually finding the solutions to a problem that they've had for a long time. So the excitement really builds. It's not something that the investigator has found and thinks this is the solution and then gives the person the action. It's like, you never have to ask people to do stuff. They're going, oh, I'm going to take on that, or I'm going to do that because I can see how I'm empowered to do that. I've got the capacity to do that, and I want to fix it, because they've been involved in those deeper discussions, both at an operational level, but also from an organisational point of view as well.
It is that empowerment that is so important in this, isn't it?
Oh, hugely important, I think. And, part of that, I think, starts very early on in the learning team process, because I think providing a really safe environment, like a psychologically safe environment for people to be able to come in and go, this is what's gone wrong, and really start to ask deeper questions around, or what's gone right, and ask some deeper questions around that. And then people kind of go, well, I've played a part in that going well, or I played a part in that maybe not going as well as what we wanted it to go. And mistakes are okay. Let's just work out, how do we learn as a collective around how we might, do this better. And I think naturally people will gravitate to wanting to take action if they feel they've got that ownership over the learning and the outcome, because they wouldn't want anybody else to do it, right? Because they own it, right? So, and
I think
it's great.
It's a really interesting point that learning is learning. It shouldn't matter whether it comes from a learning of something that didn't go as well as we thought it would. If something went well, learning is learning. And I sometimes wonder that this whole discussion about learning from success or unsuccessful work, we should actually just say learning is learning.
I agree. I think that probably where we're at in our journey is that we probably have had that way of thinking entrenched. We probably only really tried to learn from things that went wrong. That was probably where we were. I think even bringing the language into learning from things that go right in the safety context is probably something, that's really newer than in some other operational contexts. So if you think about other systems, it's probably a little bit more mature in other systems. So you think about reliability and you think about, all sorts of things. I think some of the thinking is a bit more mature. In the safety space, I think we've really probably gone down the tunnel of always looking at what goes wrong for such a long time that I think that transition to just talking about learning in our space is probably, hopefully we'll get there quicker. But I think we still really need to draw out the fact that we want to learn from when things go right too, because I think it's just so entrenched to always learn from things that go wrong.
Sometimes I think what scares some people is this quantum between the number of times it goes right versus the number of times it goes wrong. And they think that if they have to put all this effort and resource into understanding why it goes wrong, how can we do that when a 1,000-fold or a 10,000-fold it goes right? That they get this imbalance, and this is what I keep hearing all the time. And I'm saying they're not the same thing.
But also, I think too, I had a really interesting discussion the other day about somebody was talking to me about justifying the cost of doing a learning team. And I'm like, they were asking me about how I justify the cost. And I'm like, well, I don't really have to justify the cost of doing a learning team because it costs us a lot more to do an ICAM investigation, for example. So if I really looked at it cost to cost, you'd be spending a lot more money doing an ICAM and probably time and effort as well. And I look at that and I then think, well, if you were to do a learning team on say you do something well 99% of the time, well, you don't have to look at 99% of those things. You just look at one or two of them and do a learning team on that. So, I think sometimes people get it confused in their mind because it feels so different. And it can be a little bit scary and overwhelming, I think. That's why I think it's just important to have a go at it. And if you set yourself up right, I think you've got to be careful that you don't, you've got to think hard about the first one that you do, I think, or the first few that you do, and make sure you've got the right people in the room, because it can tank pretty quickly and then people feel like it's just an investigation rebadged. So I think you've got to be quite careful of that. But part of that is just explaining to the team that you're not really sure what you're doing either, and providing that psychological safety and sort of talk to them about the fact that you're learning as well. And then just have a go within the framework, and you can do it, I think as loose or as tight as you like. I think you just got to be able to read the room and really try and understand who your stakeholders are. So
right. So that sort of goes back to those soft skills.
Yeah, definitely.
That facilitator, and that's probably something that we, many of us, haven't honed where we need to hone them, because we've been working in these different models. And I always say that a lot of us, we've come from that expert model, and now we're being asked to act in a facilitative or curious model. And that's quite an unusual feeling.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think you're right. It's funny, though, because I've been, as we've been doing these learning teams, the people who've been facilitating, we've kind of coaching them along the way, because there has been a bit of hesitancy about being a facilitator, and questions like, oh, what if somebody throws a grenade and I don't know how to respond, or what if this goes terribly wrong and I can't do this? It's like, well, what do you normally do when people throw grenades? Because people do that to you all the time. So haven't you ever got up at a toolbox talk and somebody threw a grenade? Oh yeah, and this is what I do. It's like, well, why wouldn't you do that? So we're actually facilitators already. We just don't know it sometimes. So it's about building confidence, because I certainly know with my my functional group that we haven't been working in the old way, if you like, as policemen or whatever way you want to call it for a really long time. We've been partnering and coaches in the business for a long time. So a lot of those skills are already there. It's just then about getting people to understand that you can bring that, or you need to bring that absolutely wholly into a learning team and utilize it in just a different context. And then it's about building their confidence, right? You can do this, it's fine. It's nothing different to what you've been doing. It's just a different kind of process. So, and it's quite intensive. So I think, having a support person has been really helpful. We've had that. So we've had two people together. One's been the scribe and one's been the facilitator.
Yeah.
And we found that really helpful because they kind of help each other out, or if something's not if they're lost confidence or whatever it might be, that they kind of feel like they've got their backup, if you like.
Yeah, they do. And we've found it's very powerful that they can also have that reflective conversation after the learning team's finished as well.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think what we've been doing is during the soak time, getting together after day one and during the soak time, just having some conversations around, how did it go? How did you feel? What went well as a facilitator? And, where are you thinking about taking it tomorrow? And, how are you gonna build on the richness that you've got today? And even just having those conversations have been really helpful at all stages through the learning teams process. And then what we've been doing is paying it forward, or that's what we've been calling it. So the person who's been the scribe or the backup person in the learning team before then facilitates the next one and then brings somebody new in. So that we've been supporting each other in a really pragmatic way, if you like, building capability and supporting each other.
Yeah, and building that capability and confidence.
Yeah,
as they go along, moving from one next step to the next that way. So one of the things that we talked about in the book, Deirdre, was about the need to define what good looked like. That a lot of what's been happening has been quite ad hoc, and about the need that people, for those that where this is actually quite different to what they're used to, it's really important that someone needs to know what does good look like, and also it's valuable for them to be able to assess where they're at, because the thing that we keep hearing from organizations is how do we embed this to become an everyday process or an everyday practice for us. But what's your feeling about that? So having that supportive framework for people.
Yeah, I think having a supportive framework is really important. I think I think framework is the right way to put it, or a playbook is the right way to put it. I think functionally the teams are very used to having a very, very defined process, and that's been part of I guess the discomfort. And it goes a little bit back to what you were talking about before as being the expert, and sometimes we see ourselves as expert in the process as it's laid out in the document, and we're experts in filling out the fields that are pre-populated in terms of themes or whatever it is. Which almost leads you to a particular outcome, right? And so I think initially the teams were quite nervous about that, I think, but stepping back and going, actually, we have a robust process. It's okay just to have a process, and then whatever the output of that is actually up to us. So we don't need a template, or we don't need to have something pre-populated in terms of themes. So what good looks like is to be able to tell a really rich story about what we've learned. It doesn't mean that we have a really brilliantly laid out document that's spell checked 25 times. That's not what good looks like. Good looks like is that we're able to tell a story of what we've learned and how we've learned it and how we've enriched our organisation to be better, more resilient. And that sounds a bit airy-fairy, but when you're in the middle of it, people know what that feels like. So I think we just need to shift our expectations around around that we've had for a very long time. So,
and have people struggled with that because they do like that? Some people really do like that structure.
Well, I think it depends on the context of who wants it, right? So the board is obviously going to want some kind of structured something, whatever they might want, right? If it's something significant, they're going to want structure, and that's absolutely reasonable, right? But then it's about how you present it and what you present. So it doesn't have to be a particular way. You can kind of adapt it so that you can tell a story in a board paper rather than just putting numbers in, or whatever way that is appropriate for your context. At a senior management level rather than a board level, I think for me, they actually like the story a lot better. I think they're connecting to the people at the front line better if we're telling a story. So that's actually been probably the biggest change has been from a functional perspective around how we present stuff versus what they want to see, right? I think that's probably our bias. It's like, oh, well, they have to have a report. It's like, well, maybe a story and a page worth of notes will be enough, right? So I think it's then about reshaping how we think and what we do. It doesn't have to be the way we've done it for the last 25 years, unless somebody's dictating it, which is completely different. And then you have to influence, I think. And at the grassroots level, they just want to hear stuff. They don't want that sort of 25 HSE alerts. They don't want it. So I think what good looks like to them is that they hear from their peers around, what's gone well and what they can fix. And then all I've heard at an operational level is how excited people are, and people are saying to me, oh, thank goodness, finally we're doing this differently. So, and then I ask them, how do they want to communicate their story? And they come up with, well, why don't we do a little video? And they get so proud of it. So, that was their ideas, right? So
how very cool that the board has made that transition, that they don't want those numbers or the number of alerts or those type of things. That the story is so much more powerful.
Well, I think they're on a journey, so I wouldn't say that they don't want the numbers. They still want the numbers.
Yeah, sorry.
But they're really excited about seeing the story.
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, the governance piece is there, but I think when they listen to the richness of the stories, they actually then can put light and shade to the numbers, which I don't think we've probably been as I think there's a real opportunity there for us to support our boards more by giving them more fulsome information and helping them to fulfill their duties as well. So the story can do that. It doesn't need to. How we frame it up is up to us, I think.
Sorry. The numbers are flat. I mean, the numbers see the world as being flat.
Mm-hmm.
The story gives all that context.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. That the numbers can be perceived based on how they're reading them, where the story does build that whole context around those numbers. And I think, senior managers, in my experience, when I've been seeing numbers, you can, unless you're digging into them more and more, it doesn't give you the full story quite often.
But also I think the lack of a number, sometimes people don't, and the board might not understand that. So, for example, we all know the bushfires happened, but we didn't have any injuries. We didn't have any loss of property. So it's not even a number, right? It's just something that happened. But there's a richness of learning that sits in there that the board would want to know about, which is exactly what we gave to them. And that richness was at 3 different levels. So, but that wouldn't have come up anywhere in a number, in a board report.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's a great point.
So from your point of view, what do you see as being the future for learning teams?
The future of learning teams, I think...
where do you want this crazy journey to go?
Where do I want it to go? For me, it's about as long as a piece of string. I think there's so much opportunity to to have learning teams, not just in, I mean, we're starting this journey in the safety space, but we're starting to have conversations already in my business around how we can apply learning teams to customer issues or to quality issues or we've just done one on an environmental issue that we've had. And I think it's as long as a piece of string, because this for me is about how do you get better as an organisation? How do you get the richness of information from the people who are doing the work so that you can improve, and at all levels. So your organisation can make strategic decisions based on what you're seeing. And so I just can't see this as not being an enabler to a step change in terms of organisational performance as we go forward. I just don't think that there's any limit to it. The biggest limitation to it, I think, is badly done learning teams, because you could undo a lot of good work by rebadging something into a learning team that really isn't about learning at all. So I think there's some real watch points for me in it. But I think done well with the right capability and the right level of organisational buy-in at all levels, it can just be transformative, I think.
Yeah, look, it's really interesting. During the development of the book, we spent quite a bit of time with Todd around the whole topic of weaponisation, because that's where a lot of other things have become undone. Now, we can't stop weaponisation. And I was listening to an interesting conversation from Drew Ray and Dave Provan the other day, where that conversation about academic to consultants, how things get lost in translation. And I was saying to myself, one of the things that we did very early on was that we wanted to create a set of core philosophies around learning teams, which didn't exist. Mm-hmm. They existed with HOP, they exist with other things. Safety didn't exist with learning teams, because we felt learning team stands by itself. And our feeling was that if we can create those core philosophies, then it allows people to adapt it to their own environment. But the weaponization bit, you're lowering that risk, because you're going back and saying, does it achieve those core philosophies? Because I think that's where a lot of stuff, as it becomes productized, commercialized, bastardized, because this is the Australian month, we're allowed to swear, all those things. We can't stop that, but we just keep going back to, what were those core philosophies around that, and getting people to have that, I think, check in from time to time to basically say, is what we're doing leverage back to what those core philosophies were?
Yeah, well, I think that's right. I mean, I think you probably need to do that more often than you think you do, or one does need to do that more than one might think you do, because I think it's really easy to lose sight of, for example, principles or philosophies if you're moving quickly. And I think it's always worth checking in that you're meeting the intent of what you set out to do. So it's just part of that reflective thinking, I think. You go back and you think, well, have I achieved what I was trying to achieve, or have I corrupted the process, or have I let something else corrupt the process? And do I just need to take a step back and go slower, or do less and or hone more skills, or what is it I set out to achieve? And and then maybe just do a bit of reflection.
Reflect and learn. And the last thing, if we go back to the whole conversation about learning teams outside of safety, we absolutely agree. I mean, this is ultimately about operational excellence. But just before the Christmas break, I was working with an organisation that is very much focused around the ISO auditing, and they basically said to them, a learning team actually brings ISO to life, because the main principles around ISO now are about finding opportunities for improvement. And learning teams, regardless of whether it's quality, safety, environment, doesn't matter what the theme is, learning teams provide that environment to find those opportunities, to learn from those and actually drive improvement. So they've actually been really encouraged by what learning teams can actually offer. Through their own journey, they've had to transition from being an organisation that was there to find non-conformance to an organisation trying to find opportunity.
Well, it's really interesting because I've been working in my organisation with the audit and also with my risk team, and we've been looking at process safety as well through the lens of a learning team and how do you do a bow tie, for example. So we're going to actually have a crack at pulling a learning team together to develop a bow tie to see if we can really start to understand from the teams doing the work whether or not we've really got the right critical controls in place. So that should
very
be
cool.
a fun experience. Yeah. So we're gonna take one of the existing bow tie diagrams and pull it apart and talk to the people actually doing the work and see if we can learn more deeply around how we're actually doing work. So,
well, I mean, the good news is, I'll guarantee they will. I mean, that's the best part. And I think we said to some of our visual roadmaps, because we've been doing the same things. We've been using learning teams for ICAM investigations. And it's been quite interesting about what additional operational intelligence they gathered by doing that.
Yeah, actually, I did a side-by-side review for the board around that very thing, actually. I took what we learned from a number of ICAMs around some scaffolding incidents that we'd had, and then we got our contractors together and did a learning team around the same issue, and the themes were the same, but the learnings were quite different. It was really, really interesting. So thematically, you could align them both up, but from the things that actually came out, we learned so much more about our own business that we definitely didn't learn from doing an ICAM investigation, just about things like how easy it was to interface with us. If you were a contractor, how we made the process difficult for them, how when we did something different or changed something, how that really then created work for them. And so we actually learned about how we could plan things better, which we'd actually identified planning as an issue in the ICAM, but not our planning. It was actually very much directed towards their planning, yeah.
So it's a whole deficit, treating them as the deficit.
Yes, that's exactly right. So it was a really interesting conversation, and they were brilliant. Like the contractors were just so engaged with the process, and we'll definitely do more with those people because I think we've got so much to learn from contractors in the business and how we're partnering with them and how we make their work easy and hard and how we can have, good relationships, but also really open dialogue around how we make work better, more efficient.
It's a big change though, isn't it? I've been on the other side of it, working with some contractors and some large construction firms.
Yeah.
And we've been having that same conversation, but in the other direction. And you mentioned cost before. And so some of the subcontractors go, we can't afford it. And I'm saying, well, think about how much you've got 50 guys on site and it's $80 an hour and you're pre-start. How valuable is that pre-start at the moment? It's top down, So let's think about it differently. Let's look at that cost and where the waste might be and how we can actually build on that moving forward.
Yeah, and I think that also goes, and so this is one of the things that came out of that conversation, but also brought us back to our bow tie analysis, because some of the things that we thought were critical controls, when you talk to the contractors, they're going, actually, that's not the critical control, this is. Yeah. It's like, because we've actually spent a whole heap of time actually investing in checking and auditing and making sure about that. It's like, well, actually, no, this is probably the thing that's more important. You could probably get rid of that. It's like, okay. So it was really, really interesting. And I think, and it goes back to the question, where do we think this is going? I think it can go pretty much anywhere. So, that's, half a dozen conversations with somebody about one particular job, and we do thousands and thousands and thousands of jobs every month. So, I think there's so much opportunity.
Was it confronting the first time that they came back and said, well, it's not the critical control?
I don't think it was, because we were really curious. So,
Fantastic.
I think when you're really curious, you're actually just in listening. You just really want to understand. And so if we've got the wrong control in place, or if it's not what it was, we really want to know that, right? So, so that you can, do something about a massive hole in your control process. So,
Yep.
yeah.
Absolutely. Yesterday, Deirdre is with a utility company, and with their project managers who spend their entire life trying to create these perfect systems. And we had this conversation about, should we be focusing on perfection or should we be focusing on feedback? Because the holes are going to be in the system regardless. If you don't get the feedback, you don't understand what the hole is. Therefore, you can't get the system to adapt to fill the hole. But what was interesting, amongst their own conversation, the most powerful thing that they actually finally agreed on was this disconnect around the whole design element of projects. Okay. And everyone said, well, what do you mean? Well, they said, well, we get handed the stuff and we're not involved in it. So, and now we're having to try and interpret what you mean at a procurement end. And then our job is trying to interpret what it means from a worker end, and then try and come up with that. And I said, well, but then you're doing the same thing to workers. Mm. You're not engaging them in the process. You're trying to make up what they think they're doing. So I said, what we're trying to say is that this is where this whole concept of functional diversity becomes so important, that you can't be a representative of the workers. You have to have some presence of the workers so they can represent themselves.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. And I think when you are that was one of the things that came out of the discussion with the contractors as well, because obviously, if you've got a big outage happening at a power station, you have to plan, you have to do pre-planning around jobs. And so we were doing a lot of that pre-planning quite well. The contractor might come in 2 weeks before the job was actually going to happen, and so would walk through the job as they should with their teams, going, this is what we're going to do. But in the meantime, something's changed, and the day that they rock up to do the job, it's not as they walked it through 2 weeks before, because we've changed something. And so those are the sorts of things that I think they highlighted to us about how we could improve. And I think this whole piece around having planning's all very well, but it's not static, right? And I think sometimes we think that if we've planned a process, that it's going to be static and we're going to need a scaffold or we're going to need a ladder or whatever, but then something changes and we actually need a different kind of scaffold, or we need a different, we might need somebody who can build, somebody with a different technical skill, because the scaffold's now going to be different to what we planned it to be because we've changed the process. And sometimes we have this assumption it's going to be a static thing, but it isn't. And that's where I think we need to just have this open dialogue that's happening in a really dynamic way. And sometimes we forget that. And then we end up, and people talk about time. It's like, well, we waste a lot more time if we have to stop the job and then do a massive correction. You're much better off to actually have a dynamic resilient system, so that you don't actually have to do these big, oh gosh, we've really stuffed that up. Mm-hmm. We can kind of be adaptive as we go.
As we go.
It's not always like that, obviously, but I think we could be more like that than we actually are, is what I would say.
Exactly. And what they said, what they learned from the little learning team we ran yesterday, was the fact that when the workers come to them, or the supervisors come to them with that variability, so that gap between how it's planned and what they're trying to encounter, what they identified was that as project people, they were the expert, and they're now having to actually deal with this in a different way. And what they admitted to us during this conversation was that they actually didn't know how to be curious, because they've been used to being the expert and the planner.
Oh, yes, okay.
And when you come back to me with this feedback, it's telling me I got my plan wrong. Now I'm trying to internalize that. And so what they've basically said is what they need to do now is they actually need to do some soft skills development. They actually felt more like being freaking counselors now, about some soft skill development, about actually embracing that feedback. and how they respond to that feedback matters.
I think it's really interesting because I think in many regards, whether you're an engineer or a safety person or whatever you are, often we as organisations reward the knowledge or the expertise in the harder skills, if you like, because they're really valuable. Like, it's really valuable to have an engineer that's certified in your business. It's really, really important to have them, right? But we often forget that the softer skills are also just as important, but they tend to get recognised less. And so people don't tend to get rewarded for those things, or they just seem to be less developed in our organisation because we often reward and promote people based on their hard skills. So I think there's people hang their hat on the hard skills. So it's very difficult then so some people find it really difficult to go, well, maybe I'm not the expert in this, and I might actually need to learn something when the whole career has been based on being the expert at something in particular. So, and always having the answer, because we often also reward the fixer or the person who has the answer versus the person who has the question.
Yes.
yeah, absolutely. It's no different.
I think we're built that way.
Yeah. But it's no different. That goes back to that whole thing that we reward people when they innovate and get it right, and we blame and punish when they innovate and get it wrong.
That's right.
Yeah.
We've all been a victim of that, right?
I've got a 14-year-old daughter who reminds me every day. Hey, look, it's been a wonderful experience today with you, and thank you so much for sharing with our listeners your journey. I mean, it's an incredible journey, and we'd love the opportunity to maybe even later on conduct some mini learning teams with you guys about some of the challenges and the barriers that you've encountered, because more of what we're being asked of every day is the how, not the what. Now, a lot of these conversations about the what, and people are saying, what about the how? Now, and I understand that people are looking for a recipe, and that recipe doesn't exist because every cake is slightly different. But the more we can have these conversations about the how, I think it's going to be more supportive for people going forward. I don't know how you feel about that.
Oh, absolutely. And I think part of what I've been learning from my team as they've been facilitating is how rich those conversations are about, well, how did you do that? And how did you do this? Or when I saw you do that, it was really good. I really learned something from you when I heard you facilitating that way. So I think those conversations are what will build skills that currently either in some people have got them honed really well, and some people are still developing them. So I think the more that we can share that kind of stuff with each other, the better. So really happy to be involved in whatever you're thinking. So
fantastic.
Well, we're always thinking. That's for real.
So me too. I might have been accused a few times of overthinking stuff, so we won't go there. No, not today.
That's great.
It's been a great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, me too. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Thank you, listeners, for being part of this podcast. We'd love to hear your learnings from today or other topics you would like us to support you on. Go to www.podcastlearnings.com and be part of the community of practice of learning teams at www.learningteamscommunity.com.
The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the host and its guest and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the company. Examples of analysis discussed within this podcast are only examples. They should not be utilized in the real world as the only solution available, as they are based only on very limited and dated open source information. Assumptions made within this analysis are not reflective of the position of the company. No part of this podcast may be reproduced, stored in a retrieval system, or transmitted in any form or by any means, mechanical, electronic, recording, or otherwise, without prior written permission of the creator of the podcast, Jay Allen.